This is the Leadership in Insurance podcast, brought to you by FinPro Search Partners.
Insurance companies are businesses and they need to look for the long term and be sustainable.
We went from 0 to 1 and now it's going from 1 to 100.
Insurance as a concept, as a kind of service, is brilliant. The execution is what we're looking at now.
I think the companies that are going to succeed are the ones that are going to understand and master the art of intent.
When we talk about innovation, we lean too heavily to think about technology and we don't think about creating a culture of innovation.
I think innovation is essentially continuous improvement of existing processes and platforms and product.
Right? It's got to be easy. It's got to be seamless.
Good morning and welcome to the Leadership in Insurance podcast. I'm your host, Alex Bonds, and I'm very lucky today to be joined by Ty Harris, who's CEO and co-founder of Openly. Ty, thanks for joining us. How are you?
I'm great. Thanks for having me. Looking forward to the conversation.
Yeah, wonderful, wonderful. You've got a much more exotic background than me. I'm quite jealous of your office setup. Where are you joining us from? Where's home for you?
Yeah, so I live in Charleston, South Carolina for about 3 years now. But we built Openly in the early days in Boston, and that's still our headquarters, but we're dispersed everywhere. We have people in about 45 states.
Wow, really spread out. And yeah, we're going to dive into that. So those that don't know Openly, give us a lowdown, Ty, and what's the Openly business?
Yeah, so we are a recently founded tech-enabled home insurance company. So I had a long kind of corporate career in insurance, and we built Openly, launched in 2017, and the idea was really kind of twofold. One was to improve some things that are generally wrong with insurance. So, high expense ratios and, non-tech enabled annoying interactions and things like that. But we had a little bit more specific thesis, which was that, about half of home insurance is sold by these independent agents. And so even though we're selling fundamentally a consumer product, home insurance, what we really need to do is also appeal heavily to these independent agents who are selling it on and counseling the customers who are buying it. And so that's really how we win. As we go after, we say we are going to create the best possible experience, not just for the consumers, but also for the independent agents who are working with them. And that's really sort of how we've won. We're in 21 states now. We have about 300 people at the company, and it's really taken off.
Wow. Yeah, I mean, I'm always amazed that and this is not something I'd scheduled to ask you, but I'm fascinated about culture. So I want to just ask you a culture question because you have grown so quickly and you've been successful. You're across a number of 40 people in 45 states. I think how do you keep culture when you're growing at that scale, or certainly from a kind of CEO point of view? What have you done practically to try and keep culture when you're scaling at that speed?
Yeah, this was one of my great. I don't know if fear is the right word, but certainly one of the biggest challenges in the early days of Openly. I had come from a big corporate background where there was a great emphasis on the importance of not just doing things, but being a great leader. And I think at a lot of startups, people kind of forget about that part and they say, well, I've got this great product and the people side will kind of take care of itself. And before they know it, they find themselves with, hundreds or thousands of people, and they've never put effort into building, well, what's that really going to look like? So to me, there's the cultural side, there's this kind of structural side, there's what do you look for in talent. But to me, it's a couple things. One is be explicit about your culture. People often think, well, I want to be the best company that everyone wants to work for. I don't think that's actually what you want. You want to be the company that the people who want to work there are the kind of people who complement you and who you need working for you. You have to make choices. No company is going to be the one that everybody would pick as their favorite company to work for. And when you are very explicit about your cultural values, for example, we talk heavily about curiosity and integrity and teamwork, empathy, urgency, and we in everything we do at all hands meetings and praise we're giving people, we really, these values reverberate and resonate, and that draws certain, I think, types of people to the company who are going to work well the way that we like to work. So I think it's being explicit, and then I think it's being extremely. The thing you can do as a leader more than anything is be extremely picky and demanding with your direct reports. There's only so much direct interaction you're going to have with every single human being at a 300 person company, but you have to make sure what you do control is that your direct reports put the same emphasis on culture that you do and are talented and just great fits for the company. And a lot of people don't do that enough. They're not, I don't want to say harsh, but they're not demanding enough of what that team needs to look like.
I love the term deliberate, and you touched on a few things that really resonate with me. Obviously, I work in the talent industry, and there's two things that I'm always surprised about, which people want everyone to have their dream home at their company, and I kind of understand that from someone that runs their own business. You kind of have that, it's your baby. You want everyone to love your baby, but the reality is, if that's the case, then you're probably not perfect for anybody. You're better off being perfect for a few people. And then also this thing where people used to get very excited about saying, well, no one ever leaves here. And I was like, there's nothing good about that either. You need a healthy level of churn. If that churn's too high, and there's a problem. But if you don't have a healthy amount, that's interesting. And the reason I started with that question was specifically because of your background. At some point, you worked for Liberty, and I commented to you about this before. I've just seen lots of really good people come through that kind of Liberty conveyor belt of talent, and they seem to be very good at taking people from different industries and bringing them in. And I was trying to wonder whether Liberty was particularly good at it, or just they've done it at such a scale that I've spotted a pattern that isn't there. So, are they particularly good at set up for fresh talent into the industry, or is it just they're doing it at such scale? I've drawn some parallels that don't exist.
Yeah, well, look, I only have my own experience to fall back on and look at. But what I'll say, for me, I was a career changer when I went there in 2005. I was in grad school working on a thesis in a PhD program in economics, and kind of decided I wanted a different thing. Went in and said, what could I do? I was playing a lot of poker at the time. I love statistics, and teaching statistics at insurance, they use statistics. So went across the river from where I was in school, knocked on the door at Liberty, and without really knowing what I was throwing myself into, got hired there. And what I found was, maybe it was fortuitous, but I walked into a department. I was on the personal line side there, where I early on had some great, I'd say, mentors and leaders there who were very entrepreneurial in the way that they saw the personal line space there. Maybe it's because that particular company had a long history of being like kind of a workers' comp and commercial company, and personal lines was more like a startup operation, even within a big company. But for whatever reason, I had people who were willing to look at my skills, which were not from insurance, but say, hey, there's something valuable he brings. Let's, if Ty wants to work all the time and invent new ways to do things, we're going to enable that and work with them to think about being open to those new ways of doing things. So I felt really lucky. And I look at other companies. I don't know if it's apocryphal, but certainly what you hear about a company like Progressive is that in the early days, I think they put an emphasis on hiring people who were more generalist MBAs to run states like businesses, as opposed to maybe the traditional an underwriter and the technical methods they use. So I do think you have a lot of examples out there of insurance companies taking ways of working and skill sets that have worked in other verticals and bringing it into insurance and really cleaning up. Certainly the emphasis on technology over the last, 15, 20 years in insurance is an attempt to do that. I don't think it's always been right, and sometimes people have focused on the wrong part of the problem, but it's certainly a good instinct.
Yeah, it's getting close to that, hiring smart people and just let them solve problems, I think, which I think the tech world has been much, much better at. I mean, it's something I've sort of talked about a few times, is that if you look at the kind of age of a tech leader, so much younger, and not necessarily because the parallels are just the culture, whereas I think in insurance we can be quite guilty of not giving people the opportunity to fail, when actually we've probably got environments in which they can fail if we set it up correctly. So yeah, it was just an interesting thing to touch on. Still a young business. I mean, founded in 2017, I believe. But in insurtech terms, that makes you a veteran. I think now. I think that's getting on close for it. So, but you started an insurtech when at a time a lot of people were pushing the direct to consumer. You've gone for agent distribution. I just wondered, why not go down that direct to consumer route? Was it something you considered?
Yeah, no, it's great, and I think at the time we were launching, certainly the path we ended up taking was considered very contrarian, and most of our seed stage VC meetings 3/4 of those were kind of scoffing at this idea of going through agents instead of going direct. At the time, the conventional wisdom, if there was such a thing, was that the problem with insurance was that you had these intermediaries, and what you needed to do was just take this product and take it direct to consumer and eliminate cost by doing that. My answer, if you think about would we kind of go direct, or are we, is that something we've considered? That the answer really depends on what you mean by that question. I'm not trying to be cute, but when people think of what does direct insurance mean, I think they confound two different concepts. One is when I say insurance is going direct, they could mean, well, it's going to be more and more digital. So there's going to be less, human interactions and paper pushing, and it's going to be more conducted online with consumers interacting with interfaces, that kind of thing. And I think that's certainly true, that more and more of that will happen regardless of the channel that it goes through. But the other thing they mean by that sometimes is that it's the ultimate underwriting carrier connecting direct with the consumer without an intermediary in the middle. And I don't believe in that. So when we are betting on agents, what we mean is we're betting on intermediated choice for consumers. So a consumer goes to one distribution point, and they might have a partially digital interaction. They might have an entirely human interaction. It could be a digital agent, it could be a human agent, but regardless, that entity they're interacting with, computer or human, is helping to find them the best coverage and the best pricing by helping them search multiple carriers, right? And that's a different model. So it's like if you were going to buy a plane ticket, you could go to Delta Airlines website, which actually I'm a big Delta fan, so but you could go to like Kayak and shop that way. And I actually think that the Kayak model, even if you said insurance is going to go entirely digital, I think you'd probably bet on more of a Kayak model than a go, to like 10 different insurance websites and put in your 130 pieces of information to each one. So long way of saying we're building for a future where there's intermediated choice, and probably increasingly digital, although maybe not at the pace that everyone is expecting.
Yeah, the great answer to that question, and maybe realize that I could have worded it better to be more specific. But I think it's an interesting point that you raised with me when we spoke previously, and you made this statement, which I won't lie, I've subsequently stolen and used in a few conversations since. But I thought you made a really interesting point about how carriers have become, or becoming, the new independent agents. So Nationwide, Liberty Mutual, Geico, Progressive, etc. But I wondered if you'd explain that point, because I thought it was super interesting, the way that you kind of perceive that market.
Yeah, no, that's great. If you just take a snapshot of how are people buying home insurance, that's our space, as of a couple years ago, it's roughly 50% of it is consumers buy through what you would traditionally consider an independent agent. So that's an agent who works with multiple carriers who themselves say we're an independent agency carrier. We, Travelers, we sell through independent agents. We're not really direct, et cetera. The other 50% is sold through something that is what you would consider captive, or or specific to the carrier. So you have like State Farm. If you go to a State Farm agent, historically, in general, they're going to sell you State Farm's product or nothing. Allstate, same thing historically. Liberty Mutual, same thing historically. You buy the brand, and it's through a call center or through a captive agent. They're going to sell you their thing. What you've seen though over the last 5-8 years, and really taking on increasing steam, is that a lot of those historically captive channels or direct channels have said, hey, wait a second, even the best of us, who are the best call center selling a product exclusively and directly, might close, I don't know, 10% of consumers that come to them for a quote, and the other 90%, they're just not going to sell them something because they don't have the right price point, or they don't fit their underwriting appetite, or they don't have the right product. And so you're squandering this tremendous money, the billions of dollars you're spending on acquiring customers, on advertising, on all that stuff, and you're just letting them get away without leveraging that into something economics. It's also not great for consumers because they're wasting their time, in a 10% probability of buying something. So the solution to that has been that many of these historically captive carriers or direct carriers have said, wait a second, if we're not going to sell them our product, why don't we sell them something? And so they have turned themselves, practically speaking, into what I would identify as a giant independent agency, where they may not sell them the Liberty product, but they'll sell them some other person's product. And now there's a gradation, I would say. Some carriers will try and sell their own product, and then if they can't, if it's underwritten out or something, then they open up to selling others. Some of them are just saying, well, we're just going to flat out become independent agencies. So you look at kind of Nationwide has turned their previously captive sales force into effectively independent agents. And you see Liberty has made some big announcements around their giant local agency force and having them be able to sell other people's products on a fairly par basis. So I think that's the future. What those carriers are great at is getting consumers to come talk to them, and they will better monetize that by offering the consumers a choice of products. That then becomes, you look at it from our perspective at Openly, we say, well, great, that's somewhere we can sell now. So prior to that, if someone saw a Liberty Mutual commercial and went there, they're not going to ever end up buying Openly as part of that interaction. But these days they could. I'm not picking out Liberty, just any of these big carriers. That now becomes a place where we could sell our product.
Fascinating, really, because it's almost like the ultimate embedded play, right? Isn't it? They've come to you that you've got this huge brand, you've got this reputation for being a carrier that people can trust, but you can't match the price point. Someone else can. You as let's say Liberty, you maintain that customer relationship because you still serve them well, and they get the product they want. It's a really interesting change to the dynamic. It's smart, right? Because otherwise you'll put yourself in the position where, particularly in the UK, where everyone buys pretty much insurance through marketplaces, comparison sites, and there's a lot of negative impacts on the insurance industry and insurance products as a whole. So yeah, I thought it was such an interesting point that you raised, and yeah, I have borrowed that in more than one conversation. So thanks, Ty. That's been helpful for me.
My pleasure.
That's what we shamelessly do the podcast for, to make myself smarter. The other thing you said that I thought was really, really interesting was about ambition. And we talked about, you're very much aiming for Openly to be the kind of number one in home, and certainly in several states, but kind of that ambition to be the number one. Is it realistic that someone could get to number one? There's so much kind of out there that says you can't outspend the big carriers. No one can unseat them. I suppose it goes into strategy, but is that realistic? And if so, how so?
Yeah, and I think there is the conventional wisdom in InsurTech via 5 years ago was that if you just take existing products and bring them direct to consumers, you will win and you'll put State Farm out of business, whatever. I think that has been proven false. It's not that easy. I think that then people ran to, well, the only opportunities in InsurTech are these highly niche plays. And so I'm going to find some squirrely corner of commercial insurance where, no one's willing to underwrite today. And I'm going to really nail that using partly technology and partly just old fashioned, market dislocation. And that's what you should bet on. And there's some wisdom to that too. I mean, it is harder to take on a broad-based big carrier. I think we're neither of those. We're not, where we're investing is not in that old school, hey, just bring this thing direct. We're really investing heavily in the guts of what makes insurance ineffective or inefficient at the big carrier. So we don't underestimate the task at hand, but at the same time, we are pretty broad-based. We're never going to be 50% market share. I don't think maybe anyone should in insurance, given the way that it works, but we see no reason we cannot, over the next 15 years, become the number one provider of personal insurance through the independent agency channel, which, by the way, as I just said, is growing, right? And you could say that seems crazy ambition. How could you ever say that? But we have leading indicators of this. We'll look at our state footprint. We're in 21 states today, and we'll look at our new policy sales compared with the giant incumbents in the space, and we're catching up. We're you can't measure exactly how much they're selling as new business, so you have to estimate. But we reckon that we're very close to them within our state footprint, close to like the number one Travelers, the number two Safeco Liberty within our state footprint of selling homeowners insurance through independent agents. And we have way less churn than they do. We have 91% policy retention, whereas they publicly state that they're down in the low 80s. And so we say it's just a matter of time. This thing's just got to build up, and then we got to take it to more states and eventually more products. We'll eventually offer carefully paired auto insurance and umbrella, things like that. And once we do that, there's no magic. It's not like we're betting on some leap of faith that we haven't proven. We feel like we just have to do what we're doing now, but much more of it, if you will.
Yeah, but I think it speaks to your experience of working in the insurance industry prior to starting in InsurTech, and I think some of the kind of misguided growth projections, competition projections on the earlier, potentially more sort of like blindly ambitious when the valuations were going crazy was a little bit on. I didn't think the timescales were right. You mentioned there within a 15-year timescales. I don't think anyone was talking about 15-year timescales. People were talking about 5-year timescales, and and 15 years in insurance is the blink of an eye, as we both know. But it's still a kind of realistic time to kind of get that footprint, and also kind of adding value at the important points. And I think I don't know if you'd agree, but some of the kind of things I saw people focus on, I saw people selling as USPs. I'm not sure if that matters to an insurance consumer. And that's kind of like there's a bit of tech for tech's sake. But I suppose actually that's something I wanted to ask you a question on, because we talked to. There's a lot of like tech and science and what you guys are doing. You're very much on the bleeding edge of technology in how you're offering your insurance products, what you do internally and externally. But the big question I had for you was the front and center of your website is just how experienced your team is. For example, how experienced your claims team is. So what is kind of I wanted to talk about the tech versus non-tech as an edge and as you see it.
Yeah, you have to build for things that are really problems that people care about, right? And is it really, for a consumer of home insurance, is it really a huge problem in your life that every 10 years when you switch on average, that it takes a little time and it's annoying? That is annoying, no doubt, but that's probably not like in your top 10 problems you have in your life. By contrast, for an independent agent, that is a massive daily problem. The fact that it takes 20 minutes or 2 weeks to get a quote for home insurance, that is, as opposed to like 8 seconds with us, that is a massive problem for this person where that's their job. Same thing applies. What really matters about your home insurance to a consumer, maybe not that shopping experience every 10 years, but if you have a claim, boy, does that matter. Your house burned down or someone, then it's suddenly front and center and importance. And so what we've done is said, let's make sure that, yeah, we have the kind of nice to have speed and ease for consumers, certainly, but let's really tackle these problems at the moment when it matters. For an agent, it always matters how long it takes to shop for the insurance. Check, do that. For a consumer or an agent, frankly, it really matters at the time of claim. Let's not skimp on that. Let's not have a, little animal that you have to talk to before talking. Let's hire. We have, for example, our average claims adjuster across the team we built has 19 years of experience, and we've just really doubled down on being able to provide an outstanding high net promoter score driving claims experience. But I will say the tech enables the great human experience. And so in claims, for example, we handle 75% of our claims from the desk, meaning that we don't have to send an adjuster out to the house. Now, we're able to do that in part because of technology that we use. So we have ways that a consumer can go and kind of self-inspect their house and deal with us in that fashion. Now that in turn enables us to have a virtual call center of claims adjusters, which enables us to hire people with 19 years of experience, right? If you didn't have that tech, you start pulling on that thread and say, well, now I'm gonna have to always send people out. Now I'm gonna have to have people in 21 states, but we're not really big enough that we're gonna have to pay a lot less. We're gonna have less experienced adjusters, and the whole thing sort of unravels. It's the same way where in underwriting, the fact that we give a quote in 5 or 10 seconds enables us then to be much more picky about the consumers that we do let through. So the speed and ease of the quote actually enables better underwriting and better pricing, which has a different effect. It has an effect on our loss ratio. So just I guess the overarching point is tech can be extremely useful in enabling results beyond the immediate effect of the tech, but just think it through. Be careful how you're using the tech, and often that means using the tech to enable people to be in the loop with great people as well.
Yeah, that's resonated with me today. We've been trialing some new technology internally, and what we realized is that it was this classic thing of it looked good, but we realized we had to keep changing our process to fit that. And it's like, well, no, then you created a new set of problems. And it really made me think about technology in the insurance space, is that if I have to adapt to my behaviors, like I know how to buy insurance and I know when I have to do it. And to your point, it's like, I'm not that concerned about, it's a painful process buying insurance. It's a grudge purchase. No one wants to do it. So kind of having a little element of grudge, making that kind of 10% quicker isn't going to impact me. Having said that, in the last 2 years, I've been unfortunate enough to make 2 claims, and the claims experiences were completely different. One was painless and brilliant and slick and fast, and the other one was, almost like the old school. I thought someone was going to come around my house and fingerprint me, and sort of it was everything slow, everything painful, everything kind of on the sort of consumer of insurance to prove themselves, and that's where it really mattered. And it won't surprise you, the one I'm renewing and one I'm not. So it's as simple as that. At the point it counts. You've also done a few interesting things about kind of the setup of the business, and I thought this is a really interesting conversation to have. You've got a hybrid MGA captive and carrier model. There's so many ways to kind of approach this, but I think because you've kind of touched on all points, I was like, why did you go down this route, and kind of pros and cons of the alternatives? I thought it'd be really interesting to break down because of given your background.
Yeah. That's look, if you back way up, you say we're trying to build the #1 provider of personal insurance through independent agents. Now that's going to be, even in today's dollars, if we could snap our fingers and get there tomorrow, we can't. It's going to be years, like I said, but that's a 30-40 billion dollar premium business, the way that we see it. Now that requires a lot of capital of some variety. Ultimately, someone is taking the risk, someone is backstopping those losses, someone has the rainy day fund of surplus that is enabling it to make sure that we meet regulatory standards, we're able to keep our promises. Now, who is that going to be? One answer is we're going to be an MGA, and we're not going to, so we're not going to rely on our own capital markets to do that. We're going to rely entirely on other people, carriers and reinsurers who we work with. Now, that's a great model because it's very capital light, but it's a very risky model because that world has cycles that are unrelated to general investment cycles and goes up and down. And it might be one day they just decide to turn you off because the taste is not for the product you're providing. And maybe you can do that if you're a small niche business, but you really can't have a 30 or 40 billion dollar business riding on that. The other extreme is like what I'll call maybe it's unfair, but like the State Farm extreme, where you say we're just going to have an enormous pile of capital that we build up somehow over time. That's of our own, and then we're not relying on external reinsurance at all. But that's a tough model. If you've been around for 200 years, you might have that, but it's very hard to organically build that. To rely on capital markets at the early stage, you've got people who have certainly double digits, sometimes 20, 30, 40% return expectations for a business at our stage, and to say, yeah, we're going to go build a giant balance sheet with those kind of return expectations, that's very expensive. So to me, it's not an either or. It's given our growth aspirations, we need to be open to all forms of capital, and we're never gonna be just using one. We're gonna always be kind of using multiple forms of capital, and in any given year we'll be using the one that is most economical and kind of most in favor for our business. So therefore, like you said, we have this complex structure where we have an admitted carrier, we have a captive. Those two vehicles we use to take a lot of our own cooking, take a lot of our own risk, especially in this market. It's a really tough reinsurance market. Therefore, we're taking about 40% of our own quota share risk this year. That might be less 3 years from now. If reinsurance is different, it will never be zero. But at the same time, we also talk to investors and say, hey, you're not just investing in a tech business. You have to know that you're investing to some degree in a balance sheet business. And so we're also gonna, you're gonna have to have those return expectations. It's a little bit safer maybe than a pure tech business, but it's also, maybe you're not going to get the 1,000% return every year. So that's our approach. And I like I said, I don't think it's polar. I think you can play in the middle and be intelligent economically about it. And there's plenty of capital needs going forward for us that we can afford to do all of those.
Well, I think people have tried to make it a bit of an either-or conversation in the past. I think people have said, "Oh, digital MTA, and then have to be a full-stack carrier," and there's been a sort of almost an unsophisticated conversation about it. I mean, maybe that comes to boiling down to talking points on things like this as a podcast. But I thought it was interesting that you've got this hybrid model because it kind of speaks a little bit to your background. Obviously, actuarial science in the background. Also, sports statistics, and we touched on that. I didn't know you're a poker player, and I got obsessed with poker when I was at university. I was doing economics, and at one point, actually, I quit my reading week to see if I could make it as a professional poker player. I decided I could probably play the game well enough, but I couldn't deal with the emotional ups and downs. That was my the swings were tough. Wanted to switch this conversation briefly back to statistics. How much further can we go? And I know that's, in a way, it's an oversimplified question, but I suppose what I'm getting at is like, how much further is useful to go, do you think, when we sort of I sometimes have kind of had this theory that the smaller and smaller the point we get to is like sometimes we get away from the law of large numbers that makes insurance work. So I suppose I'm asking in that context, it might not be quite as mad as the questions I posed.
Yeah. No, I think there's a couple levels of the question. It's how far could one in theory go? Well, look, 5% of homes roughly have a claim each year. So if your rating model was the crystal ball, let's say, and you could predict that completely perfectly in advance, then you could capture 95% of the market who are not going to have claims. You could charge them just about anything, and win, and make lots of money, et cetera, et cetera. Now, we're obviously extremely, extremely far, but I do think it's helpful to have that in mind, that crystal ball, because that just serves as, in my mind, a break on the thinking of, well, maybe we have it all figured out. Maybe home insurance has like matured in a statistical sense. And to me, that there's nothing farther from the truth. So home insurance, to get a little nerdy, is a very, very hard problem. And that's for a few reasons. One is the risks are highly differentiated, right? The 95/5 thing I just said, the signal is very complex and there's a lot of noise involved. So the signal could be, the person and the house and the exact location and the interaction of all the hundreds of things that you know about that. So you say, okay, that's great. Let's bring in, some massive large language model style neural net and give it 1 billion parameters and allow it to figure it out. But then you run into the noise, right? Because unlike some other problems, it's highly, highly noisy. What that model will do is it'll just completely overfit, and it will predict who had a claim in the past, but not at all who is going to have one in the future. And so it's this beautiful, in my mind, statistical challenge of not overreacting to the noise at the same time that you do react to the rich complexity of the signal. So again, that's me kind of nerding out for a second, but to me, it is really exciting to work on a problem that is not solved and probably won't be solved for the next 20 years. And therefore, I look at people who are quantitatively inclined and say, hey, there's some really cool stuff. You can come make a very real, concrete impact on a business that we see daily in the market by working on very, very complex, hard problems that are even pushing forward like almost the core science. I think there are actually new algorithms that we need to be able to handle some of the highly dimensional insurance problems. So that to me is nirvana of, if I were a younger analyst coming into a quantitative field, that would be my nirvana.
True is that I don't think we do a good enough job of selling the proposition at times, because you think there can't be a more complex, the world in which to kind of look at using that kind of statistical analysis, but it just comes with this horrible baggage of being insurance. I mean, there's so many good, pithy, wonderful quotes out there about insurance being the most boring thing. I always talk about it because I'm a huge movie nerd, and it's like, if you want to see a movie if it's about anyone boring, that person is always either a claims adjuster or an actuary. They're never anything else, which is damaging to us both. I know I'm flip-flopping here slightly, but we touched on reinsurance markets when we were talking about the kind of hybrid business model that you're on, and I just probably want to finish on this, conscious of time, but it's been a really challenging sort of reinsurance market. What do you kind of perceive? Is there going to be any changes in that you foresee in the sort of coming future, or are we in for a bit of a tough time yet?
Yeah, look, I mean, reinsurance is a huge expense, obviously, for a carrier like us that doesn't have an enormous balance sheet. But frankly, you look at, once you get beyond kind of the top 5, you're suddenly reliant on various forms of reinsurance, and even the top carriers are reliant on it for big giant earthquakes or hurricanes or things like that. So everybody needs this. It goes in its own high amplitude cycles. They're sometimes correlated with the broader business cycle, sometimes not. Right now, we're at a cycle in the reinsurance market where it's property catastrophe reinsurance very specifically is probably 2 or 3 times more expensive right now in the US than it was at the bottom of the cycle, which was probably irrationally too underpriced, right? A few years ago. So it goes around and around. I will say it's so interesting to watch these cycles. You'll see the reinsurers, as of a year ago, all the kind of scuttlebutt was everyone was fleeing away from property reinsurance, climate change. You just couldn't reinsure this property stuff anymore, and therefore, and we're in an inflationary environment, therefore we're going to long-tailed casualty. And you say, well, but every underwriter, that's what they wanted to write, is something where the payoff or the court case is going to be settled in 5 or 10 years. And you say, well, I was taught as an actuary that the worst thing you could do in an environment of unpredictable inflation is flee into a line where you're not even going to know the claims cost for 5 or 10 years when you finally pay out. And so that struck me as a little bit irrational. And I think a lot of the underwriters at the time even saw that, but the owners of these reinsurance companies or the LPs or whatever their ownership structure were just saying, I know, but we've had it. We just don't want this property stuff anymore. Now that dynamic reached peak, I don't know if it's fear, probably 9 months ago, and it's swinging the other way. So I do think it's going to be very expensive, but at least available and a little bit more orderly. And I'm sure that 2 or 3 years from now, we'll be in the other part of the cycle where property reinsurance will be cheaper and everyone will see the results of underpriced casualty reinsurance. But it's like I said, it's just another reason. When I hear people say we're going to be a pure MGA model and therefore have like no balance sheet and it's capital light, it's like a software company. You can say that if you kind of close your eyes and pretend like you're not, but everyone is ultimately beholden to balance sheet capital, and you can pretend like you're not, but you are. If you're relying on carriers and reinsurance, that is just equally as hard over the long term as having to raise your own balance sheet capital. And so don't trick yourself into thinking that you're immune from balance sheet capital by using that MGA model. It's just not true.
Brilliant. Ty, thank you so much for being a guest on the podcast. You're good sport and kind of putting together some sort of fairly tricky questions there. And it's stuff that kind of it's always kind of things that are picking away at me, and the hybrid model particularly I was really fascinated by. So look, I really appreciate your time. Thanks once again for being a guest on the podcast.
Oh, thanks so much for having me. I really enjoyed this conversation and appreciate the opportunity.